Welcome to thehannibaltv.com. This is a special live edition with a man who is returning to the channel based on popular demand. It's his third appearance on thehannibaltv.com. And today we're going to be talking about the phenomenon of innocence fraud, the historical roots, some of the current cases, but we're also going to spend a lot of time on the West Memphis 3 case, for which the gentleman wrote this book, excellent book, Abomination, Devil Worship, and Deception in the West Memphis 3 Murders. I'm talking, of course, about our esteemed guest, author, true crime expert, documentary filmmaker, and very successful podcaster, Mr. William Ramsey. William, welcome once again to thehannibaltv.com.
Jack, thanks for the invite. It's great to be with you again.
This is a topic that seems to be gaining more steam, so to speak, in terms of the popular culture and the culture war itself, which we'll talk about. But if you could, I think right off the bat, it's fair to say that no fair-minded individual would wish someone who's wrongfully committed to be incarcerated. But this is an entirely different phenomena. Could you let the audience know what innocence fraud is for those that may not be aware?
It's this kind of new phenomenon that's kind of grown up, I think, around the advent of the internet and social media, where groups get together and second guess some of the cases, conclusions, the guilty verdicts of many popular or well-known crime cases around the United States. And I'd say it popped up more frequently or more recently, maybe, like I said, the internet, but also on podcasts and things like that. And it coalesced into maybe an understanding of general people in this kind of fraud, that it's innocence fraud, that they say they're innocent. And it's actually augmented or bullhorned by the common culture, maybe Netflix or some of these other podcasts, into going into these cases and turning in very serious murder cases into almost true crime infotainment, where they leave out salient and very important elements of these crime cases to, I think, create much more listener interest in these cases. And it's become known as kind of like innocence fraud, but it's actually affected the system. And there's been an Innocence Project and some of these other non-governmental organizations that are not only re-looking and kind of trying in the court of public opinion, not in court, but in the court of public opinion, retrying these cases, getting people out, and actually securing very significant 7, even 8-figure judgments that really benefit some of the lawyers that are involved in this innocence, what I would call innocence fraud. And I really didn't know. I started my research was into the West Memphis 3. I kind of came at it at a different angle. I wasn't really a true crime person that I maybe know more about it today, but back then I was interested in Crowley. But I've talked to other really great podcasters, Roberta Glass of the True Crime Report, who said, hey, there's other cases like this happening in the public where they're going through and trying to whitewash some of these things. And one of them is Adnan Syed. It was a very popular podcast called Serial, which really was in the top podcast, which we kind of tried in the court of public opinion, his case in the murder of his girlfriend, which is still incredibly, some of these cases are still in the public consciousness and in the media. But that was one that she kind of was emphasized and talked to me about the West Memphis 3 in that case. And so that opened my eyes to this whole innocence fraud. And I've done a couple shows on my podcast, William Ramsey Investigates, on it. And a lot of these subjects, because these innocent people who I believe are properly found guilty in the courts of law are still on these podcasts and big podcasts, and they're still being talked about in kind of alternate media and legacy media to this day.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the aspects of this that you touched on is the historical roots of this phenomenon, and not to say that the case of when I've done research on this, the Reuben Hurricane Carter case comes up, not to say that was of the same genre, but the emphasis on individuals that were perhaps wrongfully convicted and bringing that forward and starting a movement to assert their innocence, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk about the role, and you touched on it briefly, of these organizations that sprung up, the so-called Innocence Project?
Right. So the Innocence Project was kind of a group that went back and is retrying these cases and trying to secure judgments for some of these people who have been committed. But as far as the history, you talk about Hurricane, was it Reuben Hurricane Carter was one of them? But I called them cause celeb killers, where these celebrities have gotten involved in publicizing or supporting these cases. And I think it's very important for people to kind of like see some of these other. There was Mumia Abu Jamal, who shot a cop, but he still had public support. Clearly, they're not going in detailed depth about what really happened and how much of a radical he really was. Another was Jack Underwager. He was from Vienna. He was known as the Strangler. But another one was Jack Abbott. So there is a historical record of these kind of cause celeb. They didn't have innocence fraud at that time, but this ability to engage the public's mind in these cases and try to convince the public in the court of public opinion that these guys are innocent. Jack Abbott is a really interesting case because he had a lot of famous people supporting him. Norman Mailer, Susan Sarandon, Christopher Walken. He got out of jail and killed again. So it turns out that they were incorrect and probably should never have gotten involved in these court cases. You know, it's kind of elementary, but you have to think the reason we have these court cases and judges and trained prosecutors and we pay taxes for defenders, public defenders, or defense experts, defense lawyers, so that there's an environment where you can test the evidence and facts and have a proper outcome. So the court of public opinion is a terrible place to discuss these cases. Oftentimes you don't have access to all the evidence, all the facts, all the witnesses. You haven't gone through the rules of trials, of evidentiary hearings and things like that. So the public, I think, is kind of making a superficial analysis of very serious topics that take place in courts of law.
And do you think that this, notwithstanding the cause celebs that you touched on, but in the past, but do you think any of this could be as salient and effective without the internet, social media, and Reddit thread phenomenons, that sort of thing?
I think it's this innocence fraud is based on that. That's what they need to do. And I think that there's very unscrupulous and money-oriented people, in my opinion, who are promoting this for their own financial benefit. So I think that the Innocence Project, I think the girl from Serial, I think the stories about Making a Murder for Netflix, that they retry these cases to try to sell something. So I think it's infotainment, and it's actually kind of the darker side of what I would call the entertainment industry, where they're actually leaving stuff out to kind of get the public involved in these cases and thinking that there's some kind of like issue when a lot of these are settled cases. There's enough facts. A lot of these people had the appeals process. They had worn out their appeals, which means another set of court looks at the same facts the lower court looked at. So a lot of these have already kind of been, the process has worked. They've gotten their Sixth Amendment right to a fair trial. So I think the money element, if you took the money element out of it, I don't know if the innocence fraud phenomenon exists, or the social media. If you take the social media or the money element out of it, I don't think it exists.
What is it, in your opinion, a commonality amongst all of these cases in terms of, you're talking about the court of public opinion? Is it an essential ingredient in all of these that they have to appeal to the public sense of injustice and the little guy and all of that, and how do they go about doing that?
It's a great question. I think that's an essential element of all these frauds, is relying on the public's mind to sympathy for the little guy, a distrust of the large system. So I think that's really kind of like the ground, kind of the fertile ground that the innocence fraud world lives in. So I think that's really it. Like, and you almost see all this, like these guys saying the same thing. Oh, this guy got railroaded. You hear the same terms almost. Railroaded, didn't get proper representation. He was naive. He didn't have any sophisticated help. So I think that those are almost, if you look over all these cases, Avery, Adnan Syed, the West Memphis 3, it's almost the same kind of like preliminary narrative that precedes like what really happened in these cases. Oh, these poor guys, the black guy, a lot of racial sympathy stuff for a lot of African Americans. Oh, there's racism in the system. So therefore, you know, that's why he got railroaded. It wasn't the facts of the case or that he murdered or raped somebody. Like there's cases where like the evidence is overwhelming, like literal blood and like bodily fluids on the victim. So like, how does it get there? Like, you have to believe these massive conspiracies too, and a lot of these things. Like, you have to think that somebody conspired against Avery. Like, there was some kind of concerted efforts without motive to really like pin it on this guy when the evidence of his criminality are off the charts. Avery's a strange case because he was in jail for supposedly a crime he didn't commit earlier too, which was another rape. Which, I mean, you got to kind of go back and question a lot of the stuff. But no, it's a really good question. I do think that, and I think it may be a sensibility, whether it's in your political perspective too, that you're looking out for the little guy and the system is rigged and all that stuff. And I think you see that writ large really today in a lot of the left-wing prosecutors today, where they're like, you know, these people have been shafted in the past. This is equity. There's no criminal sentences for stealing less than $850, low bail and things like that because of systemic racism or equity. So I think that this is part of a larger cultural conflict or war, frankly. And I think the innocence fraud phenomenon is part of that, no question.
Do you think it would resonate with the public in terms of the popularity of some of these cases if it was brought to their attention? I know through your work and others that you've tried to put out the message, hey, the general public is cynically being exploited here for profit. Do you think that would resonate and dilute some of this populist support for some of these ridiculous cases that we'll talk about?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think so. I think that, you know, I think that a lot of the public is naive and wants to believe these stories too, just like we said. But I think if they saw the money that was being made or the wealth transferences, they might think differently. Like, for example, the what's known as the Central Park Five, guys who were convicted of abusing somebody. There was supposedly a new case. And I've done a couple shows on these guys. But eventually it came back around. They're back in the news today, like suing somebody for defamation. And one of the guys involved in the Central Park Five has started a political career because of this innocence. And then there was this show on Netflix that showed When They See Us, right? It's the racist implication. Like, we didn't do anything wrong. It's because the color of our skin that we got railroaded. Even though the cop or the police officer that I talked to arrested him was black too, right? So he said that they didn't actually sexually assault. They were punks. There were 14 or 15-year-old punks throwing bricks at people and punching people, and it ended up with a really bad assault. But I think if people saw the money, the Central Park Five walked out with like $50 million, and at West Memphis 3, the money aspect of the fraud, in my opinion, was also these. Well, they generated because of HBO made tons of money off the documentaries, 3 documentaries, so they milked it. In my opinion, the documentaries for HBO and celebrated, right? These are celebrated by the freaks in LA. Like, you're actually deifying like triple child killers, right? But they actually did that. And then following on is this kind of sympathy play, in my opinion, where they raised money to get out of jail, $10 or $20 million. So they were able to take this kind of concept of we're innocent to a maximum where they generated tons of money. And I mean, so the money element, I think you're absolutely right. If people knew like the money incentive that's behind this, and the lawyers get paid, right? So there's a very incentive to do this thing. So the lawyers are like, hey, I'm getting like $400 an hour, $500. I mean, I know for the West Memphis 3 case, they were able to hire one of the best appellate attorneys, Reardon, in the country, really. So he got, and they know with a lot of money from Depp and Peter Jackson, who's a famous director. I mean, part of his career was based on getting the West Memphis 3 out of jail in August of 2011.
Well, let's talk about that case in particular, because it seems to be the forerunner, at least in the last decade, of this whole phenomenon. And for those viewers of the Hannibal TV that aren't aware or haven't read your excellent book, can you talk about? And I know there's a lot to talk about, but could you talk about the origins of that case and some of the salient time frames of same, and then we'll talk about the HBO deal in more detail on some of the celebrity protagonists.
Sure. The facts of the case are in West Memphis, which is over the Mississippi River from the city of Memphis. So it's west of Memphis, right? In the city of West Memphis on May 5th, 1993, 3 young boys disappeared. They were Cub Scouts. They were out riding their bike. They disappeared. They were found the next day after a search in a kind of small ravine in a place called Robin Hood Hills. They were brutally beaten. There was a lot of injuries to their body. And they found out during the medical examination, 2 of them were tied up and drowned. So they were drowned in water. And so there was a huge search, outcry, national interest in the case because of its graphic nature. They were
wasn't one of the sorry to interrupt, but wasn't one of the boys' genitals removed?
The medical examiner said it was unsheathed. His penis was unsheathed and his testicles were missing. Never to be found, by the way. So yeah, really graphic. There were one found out that he died from getting a blunt force trauma to his head. He passed out. So somebody had hit him with a stick. So there were kind of interest in local people. There was a huge interest in the West Memphis 3. And there's the interesting thing about this case is you can see all the court documents and investigatory documents at Callahan 8K. So you can read through what really happened. But eventually they keyed in on 3 young boys. It was Jason Baldwin, Damian Eccles, and Jesse Miskelly. Jesse Miskelly was asked to come to the police station and give his testimony. He went with the okay of his dad. He was an adult at the time, I think, or maybe he wasn't. I think Damian Eccles was considered he was over 18. But Miskelly was allowed to go, and he confessed, and he implicated Jason Baldwin and Damian Eccles, and they were all arrested. That was June 3rd, 1993. And then in 1994, they were tried separately. So there were 2 separate juries, 12, one for Jesse Miskelly because he had made statements about them. So he couldn't be tried together according to court rules or legal rules. And then Jason Baldwin and Eccles were tried separately. And both juries came to the conclusion that they were guilty of murder. And the sentences were Miskelly and Baldwin got life in jail and Eccles the death penalty. So then HBO shows up 2 directors, Berlinger and Sinofsky. Sinofsky's passed away. Berlinger's still kind of around doing documentaries and things like that. But they made a documentary called Paradise Lost, and it kind of had some interest. I remember watching it back then, but that kind of created an interest in the case. Then they followed on with 2 additional documentaries where they kind of came to the conclusion and implicated 2 of the different step parents. So they moved from one on the second one to another one on the third one. And that kind of created this interest, and slowly these celebrities from LA got note of the case and became outspoken advocates for these 3 and said they're innocent, right? Innocence fraud, even though they were found guilty. And so these people were Johnny Depp, Margaret Cho, Eddie Vedder, Henry Rollins, among others, Dixie Chicks.
Manson.
Marilyn Manson. Interesting people. When you look at some of those people's backgrounds, you kind of go, oh, they're not Christians. That's a nice way of saying. So then, so that kind of created this groundswell. So then people believe them, and so it created this kind of growth in interest in the case. Damian Eccles was seen as an innocent person. He was seen as somebody who had been railroaded, just like we talked about earlier. And they started raising money. They started raising money to get him out. So there was a public donations. There was an album that was put out. There was fundraisers. And so they really started getting this, and it grew and grew and grew. And eventually, after these kind of appeals process and hiring really good attorneys, really the best attorneys, they were released on a plea deal, and they got out of jail in August of 2011. I can't believe it's that much time has passed. I published my book in 2012. I think it still holds the test of time. But I was a person personally who thought they were just innocent. I just read the stuff. And when they got out of jail, I was like, oh, there must have been a technicality. What they did is they agreed to time served and to plead guilty to first-degree murder. They all signed the documents with the best lawyers. It's very important. So they were found guilty in 94. They pled guilty in 2011. They agreed that they would never civilly sue the state of Arkansas. That was part of the plea agreement. And got literally walked out of jail, relatively free men with the guilty plea still there. So they're guilty at law. So like,
but that's an important factor that seems to be out of the discourse, and I'm going to pronounce it incorrectly again. But can you explain what the Alford plea?
It's Alford. So ALFORD versus North Carolina, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. So it's basically case law. And what the conclusion of the court is that you can plead guilty in court, but publicly say you're innocent, right? So the guilty plea still stands. They have never been able to overturn their guilty plea. They had this public thing that somebody else must have done it. They keep blaming, and this is a huge part of the social media where they keep blaming the stepfathers, one of whom has passed away. One is still alive, and he wrote a book called A Box Full of Nightmares about the hell they put him through with no evidence really, but there was enough evidence for the public, but nothing to really reopen the trial. And like I said, this was something that already went to the appeals court, and the appeals court agreed with the lower court after looking at all the facts. And they actually made a writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court wouldn't, read it. They didn't care. But
and the Alford plea means that, just to drill that down a little bit more, because I think it's important, it means that they were agreeing that there was enough evidence, the government had enough evidence to find them guilty of those murders.
Exactly, precisely. So when they signed those documents again on their own handwriting as adults, they said that there could be enough evidence to convict them in a court of law. So if they went to court again, they could eventually convict. But they got out. So they got out and they said publicly, we're going to look for the killers, the other killers, which they haven't found yet, which should be telling because it's 2024. In my opinion, they haven't looked very hard. Mm-hmm. And so, so that's really kind of the case. And it's still kind of ongoing. There's been issues about the evidence. They've tried to kind of dredge up new DNA evidence, but it's still kind of, at that time, before I read my book, it was almost a kind of a public agreement that they were railroaded. And so then I published my book in 2012, Abomination, Devil Worship, and Deception. One of the things that's overlooked about this case is all of his occult ties. Very serious, very profound occult ties. And he's continued to practice the occult to this day, writing books about the occult, ceremonial magic, and all his social media is just redolent with all this kind of themes and stuff like that. And that's what he's accused of before the thing. A lot of things are, and much like these other cases of innocence fraud, many facts are left out of the public discourse.
Which we'll talk about. But to go back to the occult aspect for a second, I think it's interesting that you highlight the fact that Eccles was even in court admitted to be a practitioner of black magic and said that he was admirer of Crowley, who I know you're an expert on, and practiced magic 8 hours a day in the penitentiary, which raised the question, if he was doing that and was dedicated to find the real killers, why didn't that happen? But do you think specifically thinking of Johnny Depp, does that aspect of because I guess they consider Eccles and Depp are brothers, is that a very strong facet in the celebrity attraction to this case and him in particular?
I think so. Yeah, they both share occult tattoos. So if you go back and look at the cover of my book, you'll see this magic circle that's covered in the Theban alphabet. That's also known as the witch's alphabet. Thebes is a state in that circle around Eccles' head is basically that's why you'll see Honorius from Thebanus. So it's the Theban alphabet, the witch's language. It's a very specific style of tattoo that also Kenneth Anger had, who's associated with the Manson family and all kinds of dark occult stuff. But inside of that, they usually will put a sigil, so it'll have secret ideas. So he actually, Eccles has tattooed that all over his body, Depp's body, and you can see this online. And Peter Jackson has the same Theban kind of motif tattoo. And so those are just one indicator. The other is all just being together. And you can go through Depp's background and his associations and what he says and his hand signs, like all the occult hand signs and things in his lifestyle. And you see that you could see that. And I've had people tell me things about Depp that my conclusion is they're very similar people who are into the occult in a very, much more profound way. They're not dabblers. That's what I would say. So, and then you extrapolate that. What are these? What is Margaret Cho? What's she interested in? I don't think she's a Christian. What's Henry Rollins in? Not a Christian. Marilyn Manson definitely knows a lot about Crowley. Wrote songs about the Temple of Thelema. Like, these are things that are specific to Crowley. And even like Eccles, tons of Crowley, and even on the stand, because one of the more interesting aspects, and this is shown in the first documentary, is that not only did the prosecutor have a copy of Crowley's Magic and Theory and Practice on his desk during the trial, they were asking questions about Eccles' writing while he was in jail, and he was tinkering around with the secret alphabet, and he put his name, Jason Baldwin, and Aleister Crowley on the secret alphabet. So you can see his interest, and it pervades a lot of his work, his knowledge of Crowley and 11s and all these important numbers for kind of black magic and things like that. But yeah, to answer your question, I think a lot of his real core occult support, his real core support from the celebrities, they're all occultists. That's what I didn't know it at the time, but since I've been writing, you can go back through Depp's career, The Ninth Gate, all the Dark Shadows, I think is another movie. They're very
From Hell.
From Hell. Thank you. And some of the other things, the Harry Potter spinoffs are very dark. Like, he's a black magician in those too. So I think, pretty interesting.
When we're talking about those documentaries, the first one was, and I saw it too back in the day, and I thought, holy cow, these poor, back in my younger day, I liked Metallica too, and I wore, black T-shirts and that sort of thing. I thought, wow, this is clearly an injustice, but it seemed as the documentaries spun out, they were looking to make it a cash cow and left out some pretty salient evidence. And one of our viewers here points out, don't ignore the Exhibit 500. Those psychiatric records are disturbing and indicate, Eccles was a guy that was pretty much disturbed from a long time back and had psychiatric issues dating back to years before the murder. What is it about or is there something about cherry picking facts and inserting them into this magical, no pun intended, but this narrative to take some full on fancy in some cases, but then sins of omission? I know you've talked about this a lot.
Yeah, it is interesting that somebody is that unscrupulous to really retell these stories with leaving out salient facts. The West Memphis 3, when I first was starting to research, I kept scratching my head. I said, why aren't you guys looking at this? The reason that Exhibit 500 is called Exhibit 500 is there's 500 pages of his psychiatric record that nobody ever talked about. And it was from 3 different psychiatric places, 2 in Arkansas, 1 in Oregon. And that was compiled by his defense. So it wasn't even available to the prosecutors at the time they prosecuted the cases in 93. It was on his appeal, his death row appeal, where they said, hey, they didn't know. And a couple of his attorneys actually said, well, if we would have had this, we would have had a completely different defense approach. We didn't know all this stuff. So it was not divulged to the public or the stuff. So that's a really crucial element, and you got to be thankful for the people who got this out of the kind of police files and put it online so people like me could read it. So that's just one thing, but this happens in all these innocence fraud cases. There's so many things that these other people are I think unethically leaving out. Almost a lot of these cases, much like Adnan Syed, cell phone records they say are baloney, which is kind of hard to fake. And then the testimony of his friend who saw the body and like saw firsthand stuff, they're like, oh, he's totally fake. So they leave stuff out like that. They always leave out Jesse Miskelly's like post-conviction confessions, which are recorded, like literally recorded on audio. You can hear him say, yeah, we did it. Damien and Jason, like he's saying it after he got convicted. So then there's so many more.
His IQ keep going down too.
His IQ keeps. Yeah. I mean, I don't think the guy he didn't get a lot of intellectual gifts, but yeah. I mean, I think his attorney was great. The guy who defended Jesse Miskelly was like, Jesse, shut up. We're on appeal. Don't say anything. He really was doing a good job. And by getting Jesse to kind of a lower intellectual level, he's less culpable, So it's like he was trying to finesse his client to get the best outcome. But Jesse was actually, in my opinion, of the three, the most honest and the one who felt the most guilty. He was always in fights, by the way. Like there's recorders that he's always punching people and aggressive. But yeah, so those are just evidences where these facts that are left out in so many Avery cases, like all this other stuff, burning the cat, things like that. A lot of this stuff isn't public or it's minimized. But like the West Memphis 3 is redolent with those type of things. Testimony, things that didn't even make it into court, things about pigs' heads and drinking blood and just general, other threats and stomping on dogs. A lot of that stuff didn't make it into the documentaries. And it's interesting because at that time, really at the beginning of the internet, that was the only way you could kind of get the information. Now you can get it. But I think a lot of people, their takeaway from the West Memphis 3 and a lot of these other cases is the documentaries, Making a Murder and things like that. So that's what they think is like, oh, Melendez, this is what we think. Well, this is a Hollywoodized version of anything. And it's really dangerous for you to think that. But a lot of people, I've had these pretty ferocious online debates with people for over a decade. And they always say, I know everything about the case. I saw all 3 documentaries. Like they come at you like, wow, I'm almost a scholar. And I'm like, you've been played. You don't know anything. You actually probably know less about the case by watching those documentaries than not watching them.
And that kind of dovetails into my next question. That being, when you first started doing your research and published your book and were out there in the public sphere discussing it, were you surprised by the level of vitriol directed your way? And I know you've had guests on your podcast that have talked about breaking free from Scientology and that fair game concept, which means, we're going to get you. And you've had some instances where I know you've been asked, about some weird contacts that you've had, for lack of a better word, wanting to meet you and blah, blah, blah. Were you really taken aback approaching this from an academic perspective by that level of aggression from the so-called supporters, fans, sycophants, whatever you want to call them?
I didn't understand the network. I didn't understand at that time. I didn't understand Eccles was a member of the OTO. So I didn't know a lot of his secret society stuff. It slowly kind of, was revealed to me. So you can actually find the records that verify that Eccles is a member of the OTO.
Could you clarify what the OTO are, please?
Sure. It's called the Ordo Templi Orientis. It started in Germany. It was a secret society the late 19th century, much like the societies that grew up in England. But it was a secret society that Crowley became head of eventually. So he became the head of a German secret society in 1925. He was voted in as the head. And then he kind of integrated all of his ideas in there. It's like the Golden Dawn, OTO. So the ceremonial magic, occultism, the Templar myth, all this stuff gets integrated into that. So then Crowley becomes its head. And really a lot of his ideas were put into the OTO, as a way to put it, like the primacy of the Book of the Law and all these things that Crowley had. And so you can read this document. Eccles' number when he was in death row was SK 931. And you can look up SK 931 on the OTO thing, and it says Eccles is a Thelemite, right? This is a term that's specific to members of the OTO or Crowley followers, Thelema, meaning will, and that he had his own library at the OTO Head Center in Arkansas because he had so many books. And actually, he stopped paying his payment for a rental unit, for like a rental garage, storage garage, with all of his stuff. And that was kind of a story I did back maybe 5 years ago. But in that storage garage, he had reams of books. So people would send him books on magic, and he was reading a lot of those. He's a known reader. I think he's actually pretty intelligent. He just went to the dark side. Yeah, so the OTO he's a member of that. And I think that was kind of the Ferocious is the network. He's, my opinion, he's still very networked with a lot of different occultists. There were pictures of him with a really very well-known occultist by the name of Genesis P. Orge. And that is kind of one of the real transsexual rebels, or really one of the first that precedes this whole transsexual movement today. I think that and you see the satanic aspect of the transsexual movement as well, which is kind of like this pan-gender kind of ideology overlaps with Satanism, if it's not just outright Satanism. So Eccles has hung out with him. There's pictures of him with Eccles with Ozzy Osbourne, Marilyn Manson. So he is known to, and some occultists that people don't know much more about or really aren't public. So I didn't know a lot of that stuff. So I was kind of going into the, serpent's lair or something without really knowing everything. But yeah, there was like one where I was going to make a documentary, and this is 10 years ago. I wasn't established and as well known, but once I put out these books, but I was doing a documentary and people threatened me. I mean, I get threats all the time, ridicule, character assassination, the whole bit, but I was threatened. And then there was a thing where somebody said, "Hey, I know it's short notice. I want to meet you in Los Angeles." And
by Spawn Ranch.
Yeah. No, I think that if I would have gone, they would never have seen me alive. I think they want to get me into like a dungeon and pull all my teeth out with a pair of pliers. So I think it's that bad. So I'm like, I can't do certain things and go certain places. But I'm like a person of the day. I get up in the morning and go to bed early. So these people are all midnight people of the night. So it kind of keeps me safe. It's almost like Omega Man, like the Charleston. I don't know if you remember the Charlton Heston movie, but yeah. I definitely, it's pretty hairy. Like, there's a lot of people sense. I think that the mindset is like, why are you folk? Like, my sensibility is kind of a Christian outlook. Like, well, I want to tell the truth. You're lying. You're deceiving all these people, and I think you're dangerous, in my opinion. And to them, it's like, why are you trying to take away my power? Why are you focusing on me? Why are you coming to get me in particular? So I think their view of this is like, they don't sense that maybe I'm doing it out of a sense of right and wrong. They take it like a personal effect, and a lot of savage stuff, a lot of really rough stuff. So, yeah. He's surrounded by some pretty scary people. I've been threatened to sue. I had my book taken off Amazon. For people who don't know, I had a copyright suit, possibly. It's a lot of threats. I published a lot of those. I got off Facebook, but they were all back on Facebook on my old page.
Mm-hmm. When you look at that, the strength of the phenomenon and the cost to the court system, to the general public, when you look at it through a 360 perspective, do you see? What kind of piqued my interest in this again was on the heels of Making of a Murder. Now we've got similar sort of discourse around the Menendez brothers, and they were wrongfully convicted. Scott Peterson, and then just recently that case out of Delphi, Indiana, of a guy, similar situation, confessed 60 some odd times, and it just seems to be a continuing sort of discourse and phenomenon, and you can understand how the people that are incarcerated want to get out of jail, so by any means necessary, and then the other folks that are profiting from it. Do you see this as something that is ever going to sort of dissipate, or is it just too, for lack of a better word, sexy for the general public to latch onto?
I think it goes back to the financial incentive. I think that a lot of these people who are okaying it, the producers and people like that, are making money off the kind of controversy. So they're looking for subjects to be controversial, and they're making the controversy. So I think like Peterson's obviously guilty. So is the Melendez brothers shot their parents like 15 times with a shotgun. Who else was it? So these kind of things, to revisit them, like you said, like I think true crime is the number one genre out there, podcasting and TV and stuff like that. So people are trying to feed that into. So I think the money thing is really important. I think that's really the core, honestly. I think it's the root of all evil of this, is that people will willingly distort court cases and really serious murder cases for coin, and kind of I guess trick people's minds at the same time. So people have invested so many things in the West Memphis 3 too, like money and life and for their money to get them out, and then they're like, oh my God, this is fake. Like, so think about all the poor people who believe these guys, just because, I mean, you assume a documentary is honest. That's what I would say. And they're not. Just because it says documentary doesn't mean they're documenting the truth. But I don't think it's going to end until the public wakes up and goes, look, you're like a fish on a hook. You're being pulled by these dishonest. And I think that's why Hollywood is dying. It's literally dying right now. Like LA and the industry itself has changed and morphed, and people's positions have changed, and the public has become more sophisticated. So I think they're becoming aware that there's a lot of dishonest operators out there. But I think as long as that they'll get people to watch these shows, there'll be dishonest operators to distort the record for the public. And the public has to realize, like, most of these guys doing these court cases and judges, they're experienced. There's not that much corruption in the criminal cases. It's really strange to think that somebody would really, I mean, West Memphis 3, they tried to make the judges look like tools out of the Dukes of Hazzard. So I think it's actually, this is a kind of almost a coastal thing, where the elites on the, like a lot of times on the coasts, think that the Midwest is a bunch of guys with the stars and bars and KKK members. Like, they literally think that. If you look at the first West Memphis 3 documentary, they literally show us a picture of the stars and bars. Like, that's what they focused on. So they're sending that imagery out. And so a lot of people thought I thought the original judge in the West Memphis 3 case was a great judge. And I thought the prosecutors were good. I didn't like the kind of Southern accent of one of the guys, but I thought the guy Price did a great job as an attorney. But I think they're caricaturing like the center. So I think it's a red-blue thing. I think it is. And a lot of these cases are in Texas, Arkansas. It's very strange, like how these innocent fraud cases are in considered conservative locales.
Because that's another feature that's almost universal in these. In addition to, say, prosecutorial misconduct, it's always corrupt cops, right? You look at making of a murder, and then I found it was interesting in the West Memphis 3, they were talking about, well, some of the cops were corrupt and blah, and it was a completely unrelated narcotics investigation where one or two of the detectives on that file were also on the West Memphis 3 investigation.
And it wasn't even that big of a thing. This is very interesting because in that, when they found that garage I was telling you about, they had the cases, and they had the cases from that investigation, the drug investigation, and somebody had taken something out of the evidence locker, and it wasn't even a very high value, but they took it very seriously. But Eccles and his wife at the time, or somebody, had asked and paid a serious amount of money to get those documents from the earlier case and print them all out, and they were in that garage. So somebody took pictures of some of them and showed me. So that narrative, that element, was divulged to the public as kind of a PR element that I think, in my opinion, based on finding those documents in that garage that were paid by Eccles and Co. That was one of the things, and it wasn't a huge amount of money. Like there was, I think it was maybe they investigated something for $500 missing. Like not that much. They did a very thorough investigation to see what happened with that. But it is interesting. They've really tried to find dirt on the cops. So people think like this is some kind of like honest, like, oh, we had some kind of internal thing. This is, they tried that somebody looked out to try to impugn their reputation, which is kind of what happens these days.
Mm-hmm. One of the other factors that jumps out in these cases is and I'll ask you to kind of summarize it a little bit, is the CSI effect, and there's no DNA, and how DNA, or the lack thereof, seems to be the case closed. It should be the entire exonerating factor, and that's something that really resonates with the public, does it not?
Yeah, no doubt. So the CSI effect is from watching a lot of TV, where now DNA, which really came kind of into criminal courts within the last 2 or 3 decades, if that. So only 2 decades of that. So the criminal systems all over the world have worked without DNA for millennia, literally, and are able to convict people and put people away. But it's really interesting because that's a key component of the West Memphis 3 case, is that there's no DNA. And then according to the investigation done by third parties or done by these guys, the West Memphis 3, they supposedly found DNA of the stepfather, and that impugns the stepfather. But it's supposedly it's supposedly they in the public mind it is the stepfather's, but it's not. The actual reality is that it's consistent with the stepfather, which doesn't mean anything because there's all kinds of DNA transference that could happen if the kids are in his house, which they were. So hairs, flip around all the time. It doesn't mean anything. But in the public mind, that is a very skilled PR narrative to solidify public opinion about the case. So I think the DNA stuff is very important in this case. And also, you don't really need the DNA to convict if you have firsthand testimony and these things, and people who see things or other evidence, cell phone evidence or other things that are enough to convict. It's really what's, is there a jury that, based upon, a reasonable doubt, the standard is evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody's convicted. That's it. Mm-hmm. So, but it is interesting that in the public mind, no DNA, innocent, DNA, guilty.
You kind of touched on the Hollywood factor here, and one of the questions that I wanted to get your opinion on was, as we saw in the recent U.S. election, where celebrity endorsements had nil or even a negative effect on the one campaign, and the general decay of the Hollywood infrastructure, which get behind these cases. What impact, if any, do you see on the lessening influence that celebrities have in matters other than entertainment, that you could see on these cases in terms of raising the profile, fundraising, or do you see that as pretty much status quo?
I think that people are keying into stuff. They're getting more serious. Like, the issues are so serious. Open borders, rising crime here in the States. Every major city, urban center in a blue area looks like a third world nightmare, really. Maybe a fourth world. It's really kind of like almost close to Mad Max. Literal Mad Max. I'm not joking. So I think that, if somebody's going to like, these guys have been in power for 4 years and haven't solved anything. So the celebrities going out hasn't tricked. And maybe somebody saw this horrible, like, see it as even a nightmare. Like, you bring out Megan Thee Stallion for $5 million to shake her body, and like, wow, this is what our future is. You're doing me a favor. You're showing me the exact opposite of something I want to vote for. Like, I want a serious person who's going to make serious changes and be able to do it. So I think the era of the celebrity endorsement is certainly on the decline, if not dead, if not completely dead, because it didn't work at all. What is interesting in the opposite is the potency of the podcast. At the very end, these guys, both Trump and Vance, went on kind of male-oriented podcasts, really at a very important timing too. So they were on Theo Von. These are huge. Rogan, Vaughn, and Tim. Oh, Tim Dunn, what's his last name? Anyway, another comedian. These guys went on and just showed themselves as human and could talk for 3 hours straight, right? On a variety of different subjects. And I think that's what solidified. So it motivated people to get out and vote. And so all the fraud here in the States, I think 20 million of the votes on the left are totally fake. I think that they're either massaged through fake ballots or through algorithms on these electronic computers. But I think it was enough to overwhelm the system. They're still fixing the votes right now. Like it's over on the 5th and all of a sudden the vote has changed. Like this is criminality. It's blatant criminality. And I think that's really kind of ties into actually to the innocence fraud phenomenon is, do you want to live where they can overturn elections and overturn court decisions and have total lawlessness and determining people that aren't serious in the public mind or the court of public opinion and making those decisions or not? Or do you want to have serious people who've been trained and are competent to help run your civilization? So I think that that's really what happened in that vote is like they drag out all these ridiculous celebrities. And I mean, the money they paid is off the charts. And you can only admire the celebrities for getting $5 million to go out and dance or to show up. Like I think Beyonce got $1 million to just show up somewhere. Good for her. Yes.
Well, William, we're past 50 minutes. Is there anything else that we need to cover that you would like to add, or any closing thoughts on this phenomenon?
Watch out for true crime infotainment, where people are just selling you a story and trying to make money out of it and changing the court record. I would try to go to the core documents that if you can find them online. A lot of these cases, the appeals are online. Read those. And, these are very serious instances. And some of these people have gotten out of jail and killed people or gone back to crime. So you got to really watch out. And some people have a real serious financial interest in this. And so it's not some kind of like environment where somebody's doing it out of the, for right or wrong sensibilities. There's other things going on. So people need to be careful of that. I've done a lot of shows on my podcast about this issue on a variety of things. Amanda Knox, Eccles, follow-ups with Eccles on Tim Pool, just rolling Tim Pool like crazy. Like this is supposedly a legitimate journalist. Like he just got clowned. Like I felt pity. It was pitiful. Like it was so bad. So you got to really watch out. So these guys, they're very unscrupulous and will just like looking for a mark, like a con man looking for a mark. They're out there. So don't become a mark and watch out. And you can read my book, Abomination. I wrote it 12 years ago. It's unbelievable, but it's still selling. I still consistently get it sold, and I've never been sued in all my work. 5 books, 5 documentaries. I haven't had a fake suit yet. So I know the thing about what made me impervious in Abomination is that I just took stuff from the court records. It wasn't like I just organized them in dates. So I wasn't like a majestic intellectual, chore or something. Like I'm not like a philosopher, Aristotle. I just put things in time and date so people could go, oh, these are the factual facts. These are the
hyperbole.
Yeah.
Well, I've heard you on multiple topics across the spectrum of guests as well say that the best thing that the public can do if you don't want to be bamboozled or a mark or get caught up in a bunch of falsehoods is do your own research. We have this internet now that allows great strides in that regard. So I think that's a very important message to get out that you always do.
Yeah, and there's other really good podcasters or people looking into things. So I think that you can go back, like the record is there. Like I've done a lot of work. It's you can just go to True Crime Report or William Ramsey Investigates, type in Eccles to your search engine or the search engine within the podcast and listen to your heart's content. It's all it's all evergreen.
Well, where can the viewers of the Hannibal TV keep up with? I gotta put your podcast over. It's one I listen to multiple times a week. Big fan, and you're within the top 5%, I believe.
0.5. So I think that puts me top 15,000 in the world, maybe something like that. pretty close. So I cover a lot of different subjects, not just true crime. I cover cultural. I do a lot of book reviews on stuff. Really smart people smarter than me, doctors. I had a lady on, Ada Ferrer, who won the Pulitzer Prize for her fantastic, deserved Pulitzer Prize for a book, Cuba, an American History, which is really amazing how involved this small little island, how it's influenced the USA on so many different topics. So really a great book. So I've had a variety. So there's a lot. Somebody called my podcast Mind Candy. I wanted to change it to Mind Candy, but somebody beat me to it. There's another Mind Candy podcast out there, but it kind of is that. So I cover a lot of stuff. JFK is coming up. I think it's the 62nd anniversary or something, 61st. So I'll do shows on that. I've done 25 shows on JFK with a lot of experts who know more than me. So, there's a lot of interesting topics there.
So that's William Ramsey Investigates, and it's available on all the usual platforms, I take it?
iTunes, Spotify. You can go to my website, William Ramsey Investigates, if you want signed copies of my book or Abomination. And then I have 5 documentaries that are available on my Patreon. You just pay $5 a month. You can watch it. And I'm going to put up my old Abomination documentary. I did a lot of videos when I first did my book in 2012. And I want to republish those because YouTube censored and taken away that history. So I'll be putting those up on my Patreon so people can watch those.
Well, I really appreciate your time again. It's always a fascinating discussion, and we will no doubt do further in the future, because I think you're doing in addition to providing strong content, you're raising consciousness in areas that we need our consciousness raised in. So want to thank you for joining me again today.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be with you again, Jack.
Well, that's it for this podcast, this special podcast with William Ramsey. If you haven't already, please subscribe to thehannibaltv.com. Hit that notification button. Our subscribers are going through the roof, and a lot of it is due to excellent content like this that you won't miss any of if you hit that notification button. Until then, I'm Jack Kilby. Take care, everybody.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and click the subscribe button to not miss any of our latest shoot interviews, match videos, or